Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. Please submit your comments and questions by using the Slido window on the right-hand side of the video. And if you're tweeting, please use the hashtag PBE events. Today, we're joined by Secretary of State and Treasury Minister David Gauke, Chief Economist and Chief Executive of Pro Bono Economics, Matt Whitaker, and Claire Moriarty, Chief Executive of the Citizens Advice Bureau covering England and Wales. We brought this panel of experts together today to try and make some clearance for us, given the chaos that's been going on in the last couple of weeks, to try and understand what this might mean for charities and for all of us going forward. As we saw even just this morning, the Bank of England had to intervene again to try to stabilise the financial markets. And against that background, there's increasing demand for the services of charities and a lot of concern about where all this economic chaos might take us in the months ahead. So hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on that today with our panel of experts. So first of all, we'll have Matt Whitaker, who can set the economic background for our discussions today. And he's got some charts to help us try and understand, particularly what's going on in the bond markets. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Nicola, and hello, everyone. Well, the good news actually is I'm not going to share any charts on gilts or on exchange currencies, primarily because I think actually by the time I finish speaking, they will be out of date. So good news for all. But actually, you're absolutely right. That backdrop, and I'm sure David will touch on this in much more detail, is a really important one to this conversation and to what's going on at the moment, not just for charities but for the country at large. And in some ways, talking about sort of micro policies here and there can feel a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if you're in a full-blown financial crisis. But nevertheless, it's important to get both the big things and the small things right. And so if David's going to touch today on that macro picture and the politics of it all and what the government does next, and Claire, I'm sure, will touch on what's going on in terms of demand for charity support and what Citizen Advice in particular is seeing. I want to focus really on the other side of the equation, if you like, the capacity that charities have at the moment in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and one that comes obviously hot on the tails of what's gone before in terms of COVID. So I'm going to sort of run through a few different charts which sort of pick up on that. But I think just really to sort of set the context in the first instance, it is worth thinking about sort of a reminder of the pinch that we're all feeling, and also how that is distributed across different groups. So a few sort of factoids here from spring, and so the various numbers here, I think it's fair to say some of them will have got worse already, some of them will get worse in the coming months, but it's helpful to have these particular figures because they do show some differences across different demographic groups. So just to run through them in turn, at the top there you've got 35% of renters saying that they're finding it either very or somewhat difficult to meet their rent payments, and 19% of mortgages. So 1 in 3 renters, 1 in 5 mortgages saying, even before we start to see interest rates rising, that they were finding it difficult to meet their housing costs. That will have got worse with interest rates rising. It will get worse again in the coming weeks and months, and obviously that's a very critical aspect of people's day-to-day lives. Whether keeping the roof over their head and being able to meet their payments sort of determines what's left over for everything else. And I think it's a good reminder that although we will sort of hear more and more in the papers in the coming weeks about people with mortgages, because interest rates clearly have a very direct feed through there. It is the same pressures being felt by renters as well, and actually they're starting from a base where they were already more exposed, and so this will turn into a more widespread housing challenge, I think. And that feeds really into the next one, which is about the proportion of people saying that they're spending less already on food and other essentials because of rising costs. And here you've got it split between those who live in the most deprived parts of the country, so the 20% of households living in the most deprived parts, and the 20% living in the least deprived parts, the sort of most affluent parts of the country. And what you see actually is, yes, there's a difference. So 37% of those in the most deprived areas saying cutting back on food and essentials, but 24% of those in the most deprived, actually, that's a pretty big number, 1 in 4, even in our most sort of affluent areas. What it tells you is that this is a broad-based challenge, which is affecting everybody. But what this doesn't tell you, which I think is really important here for the context, is that what that feels like will be very different depending on whether you're in a situation where you are already close to the edge, or in a situation where you have more capacity, more resilience, more to fall back on, which very much leads into the next stat there, which is around those households saying that they would be unable to meet an £850 cost that suddenly became necessary. And on that level, on that statistic, you've got, within the most deprived areas, half of people saying that they would not be able to do that. And in the least deprived areas, 17%. So clearly the resources that are available to families in different parts of the country, in different parts of the income spectrum, will be very different indeed. And that's a really important part of the context here. And then, again, associated with this, just coming into that final one there, looking at the extent to which people are saying that they're using more credit or borrowing more than they were a year ago. Now, some of this will be for fun stuff, but a lot of this will be for day-to-day stuff. And again, what you see is that 26% of those in the most deprived areas, 13% of those in the least deprived areas are having to fall back on credit. And that's clearly, that's not a great situation to be in, and it's certainly not a great situation to be in when interest rates are rising. So you can see the various bits of pressure which are starting to build on different parts of the country. And I think it's important to show it like this, because there's a complexity here, which is that this is a very broad-based crisis which is affecting all of us. And in isolation, we will all feel like we need to be tightening our belts, and we need support, and we need to be thinking about what we're doing in order to mitigate the challenge. But it is still one which is falling more heavily on some rather than others. And so that's a very difficult challenge for government and for others to have to deal with. And of course, what we all know is that charities are going to play a big part in this. Already we're starting to see charities, demand for charities going up. I'm sure Claire will say more about that. But we know that charities, the nature of them is that they'll step in, they'll do what they can, they will be that sort of like fourth emergency service, if you like. But against that backdrop, this chart worries me. And the point is that the different types of crises, different types of economic shocks affect the charity sector in a very different way. And I think the nature of this particular shock is one that is affecting the sector, or will affect the sector, in a particularly profound way, and one that makes it very difficult for it to play the role that we want it to play. So this chart here, the pink bars are showing you year-on-year growth in charity income from the public, at different sources, whether that's donations or traded income. It's what's going on year-on-year in terms of, is money going up or money going down that's coming in from the public. You can see it sort of bumps around a little bit over the last few years. We don't have especially recent data on this. I think NCVO will be producing the next year's worth of data in later this month. It's one of the challenges of being in this sector is that we don't have particularly timely data, but pre-pandemic, this is the picture. And if we overlay on that consumer confidence, so the particular measure here is what people think about their own personal financial situation in the next 12 months and the difference from their sort of long run expectations. You can see it's not a perfect match, but it's, the ups and downs are pretty similar. They tend to move with each other. And that might seem obvious to some extent, okay, people are poorer, so they're less likely to be able to give to charity. But actually, the relationship isn't quite as direct as that, because if you look at certain crises, certain downturns, certain moments where people have a drop in their income, they're able to look through it because they recognize that it might be temporary, and they recognize that it's important to give to charity, and so they continue giving to the same extent that they used to. Where that doesn't happen, where you start to see actual cuts in donations, is when people are feeling uncertain and lacking confidence in their own personal financial situation. And that's worrying because over the last couple of years, pandemic obviously dropping confidence, and then something of a recovery. But right now we're in a position where confidence is falling off a cliff. And so although we don't yet have the data on what's going on with charity donations and money coming in from the public, it's very likely, if it's followed the pattern of the past, that it is dropping. And already we are seeing that in some survey data. So I think we're going to see more and more of these sort of next few months, but this one is from YouGov, some work they did last month, which asked people a whole bunch of questions about their interactions with charities through the cost of living crisis. And as you might expect, lots of people said charities should be playing a really important role over this period, and people should be supporting charities as much as they can. But when people were then asked, well, what are you doing? What's happening to your donations? As you can see here, the purple bar is showing you the proportion saying that they're donating less financially to charities because they're having to cut back. The green bar is showing you those who are donating more, and 1 in 4 people say they're donating less financially since the start of the cost of living crisis. A net balance of 16%. And that's true again in the same way that this is a broad-based challenge. It's a broad-based response, so across the different age groups, and indeed across the social groups down there at the bottom. So yes, while it's true that we're seeing more of a cutback in donations from those at the lower end of the sort of income spectrum, it's still the case that 1 in 5 of those in the top half of the income spectrum are saying that they're cutting back on their donations to charities. So just as we need charities more than ever, we are likely to be seeing a reduction in donations from the public. That's one big source of income for charities. What about the other one? Government. Well, if we're going to see cuts in public spending of the scale that the IFS have predicted today, or said is necessary today in its green budget, then that's clearly a further challenge for the sector, to say the least. And that's because when we get austerity, we tend to get cuts in government spending on charities too. So this chart is just showing you what happened last time around. So day-to-day expenditure on public services from the government is what this orange line is showing you. And post 2008, it goes up, partly because we spent more and partly because GDP fell. But then that period of austerity from about 2010, 2011 onwards, you see that clear reduction in spending on public services. Well, we see something pretty similar in terms of charity income for government, from government too. Again, not necessarily a direct relationship that always and everywhere holds, but it's very likely if we're going to see the scale of spending cuts that, as I say, IFS and others are talking about, then we're going to see further cuts to income coming into charities from government. So clearly, that is a huge challenge. You've got money from the public and money from the government likely to be constrained to some significant degree over the period of the next sort of 12, 24 months or so. That's a problem going forward, but actually there's a problem in the here and now too, which is that high inflation is obviously eroding the funds that are already in place in charities. And it's part of the nature of the charity funding mechanism is that lots of money is brought in up front, which is then spent down over a period of time. And clearly that's more challenging in a period of high inflation. So just a couple of factoids here. Think about direct debits. So the average value of direct debits has sort of hovered really around about £20 for the last 5 years. Doesn't really change very much. Nice round number. We tend to set these things up and then stick with it. Now, in a period of sort of modest inflation, that gets eroded a bit. In a period of high inflation, clearly that gets eroded much more quickly. So we're now in a position where if somebody was putting in £20 a month back in January 2017, that same direct debit is only worth £16.47 today. And if you scale that up across the entire sector and you think about all the money that came in the first half of this year, not just from direct debits, but from all sources, then our estimate is that that is now already worth about £500 million less than it was when that money was first pledged, just over the course of the first half of this year. And that's a similar story in terms of charity reserves. So again, we don't necessarily have the most timely data on this, but pre-pandemic, on average, charities had about 6.2 months worth of expenditure in their reserves. So they were able to sort of keep going for about half a year, even if all income was shut off. Inflation alone, so forget all the other pressures, but inflation alone is likely to have knocked half a month off that figure already. So the limited resources that charities have are being asked to stretch further, and that's becoming harder and harder. And that's actually, as I say, this is a pre-pandemic figure. We know that over the course of the pandemic, charities were already drawing down their reserves. So they're probably starting from a much lower base than I'm suggesting here, in which case that reduction is all the more serious. And just in terms of the implications of all this, what does it mean? Well, that last factoid there on salaries, going into May 2022, on average, charities had increased their wages by 3.8%, which we don't have a time series of that, but I think if we did, then it would sort of be as high as it's been for a very long time. But obviously that's not matching inflation, and it's also not matching what's going on in the private sector. We already know there's a pay discrepancy between the social sector and the rest of the economy. We did the work a month or so ago, shows there's a 7% pay gap for people with exactly the same qualifications and profiles just by being in the social sector. Well, if salaries are now falling further behind again because charities simply can't keep up, then that's a problem. It's a problem at a period when we're trying to increase capacity within the sector. We're trying to retain our best talents and recruit new talent if we're not able to keep up with what's going on elsewhere. So overall, a pretty grim picture. You've got elevated demand for charity services. you've got highly uncertain funding backdrop, but which is almost certainly shrinking, and then that's feeding into a growing recruitment and retention challenge. So there isn't a great deal of good news out there. So just finally, so that I don't end on something that's quite so negative, I just want to make a plea, I suppose, for why we shouldn't give up on redistribution just yet. So the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have talked about prioritising growth over redistribution in their economic plans. Now, I don't see them as being substitutes for each other. I don't see them as being competitive. I think they're actually complementary. But also, I think, particularly at a moment of crisis, and as we showed in that first slide, looking at the pinch that people are feeling and how that's falling particularly heavily on some more than others, I think redistribution is still really important. And that's difficult to do in an environment where everybody's feeling like, their budgets are being squeezed. So even those on the high incomes, as we saw at the start, are feeling like, well, I need to cut back because times are tough. So how do you encourage people to voluntarily redistribute in that environment? I don't think it happens by accident. So one option is obviously you do tax and spend, and personally I would reverse the tax cuts that the Chancellor has penciled in for the coming years. I don't think the timing is right for that right now, but assuming we don't get there in the fiscal statement at the end of this month, then how do you encourage more private redistribution through philanthropy, through donations? So this chart is showing you the excess savings that as a country we built up over the course of the pandemic, because we couldn't go out, we couldn't go on holidays, we couldn't eat in restaurants and so on and so forth. Over £200 billion worth of excess savings built up. We've started to draw down on that. The IFS Green Budget today talks about the fact that there is money out there, but we've got no mechanism for releasing it. Well, actually, the recommendation we've made at PBE through the Law Family Commission on Civil Society is that we should have a philanthropy commissioner sitting at the heart of government, who actually actively works with government and with the people who have the wealth in order to plug that gap, in order to match the demand and the supply, if you like, of resource. And that's something which I think will help in the short term, but also, to go back to that idea of growth, is something which the government should be focused on if it's serious about sort of changing the course of the economy and getting it onto a growth trajectory. There is money out there. Redistribution still matters, but it's not going to happen by accident, and we need to be nudging. Thank you.
Go over to David Gauke, former Secretary of State and Treasury Minister with responsibility for tax. David, you spent a long time in government. Perhaps you can help us understand what thinking might be at the moment and how best charities can make their case.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicola. And let me sort of start off by saying a bit about what I think has happened and possibly what is going to happen at a period of time where the government is faced with a range of very difficult, if not impossible, choices, largely brought on by itself, but nonetheless, they now have to decide how to go forward. I think it is worth going back to the 23rd of September and the mini budget that Kwasi Kwarteng presented to the House of Commons. It seems pretty clear that what they had in mind was a willingness to borrow an additional £45 billion in tax cuts, to fund tax cuts, in the hope that the markets would just accept that, that because the government was setting out what they saw as an ambitious supply side program, because the tax cuts they believe would help produce additional economic growth, that the markets would take these measures, take this package lightly, and although that there might be a little bit of market turbulence, largely things would stand much as they were. That obviously proved to be a mistake, that the markets reacted pretty well instantly, with gilt yields going up and the pound falling. It was then exacerbated by, over the weekend, the government briefing and the Chancellor essentially confirming in an interview with Laura Kuenssberg that they were looking at further tax reductions, not funded by spending cuts or tax increases elsewhere. And by the time we got to the Monday morning, the markets were well and truly spooked. The pound fell to a record low against the dollar. And gilt yields perhaps more importantly, continued to rise. And it was only an intervention by the Bank of England in that week that calmed things down, at least for the moment. Then politics started to take over, objections coming from Conservative MPs over the abolition of the 45p rate of income tax. And the Chancellor, on the morning of his party conference speech, was forced into announcing a U-turn on that particular policy. And of course, then the debate focused on uprating of benefits and whether that was going to be in line with inflation or earnings, a row that continues to simmer. As we saw yesterday, we are not out of the woods as far as the market is concerned, for perhaps understandable reasons. Although £2 billion of the £45 billion has been dropped, that still leaves £43 billion. That is a lot of money to have added as a sort of permanent deficit. And the government will be thinking, well, how do we address this, given that the markets are so nervous? And of course, by the markets being nervous, the government's debt interest bill has also gone up, the IFS suggesting something in the region of £10 billion a year. And so we get the IFS saying that essentially, if the shortfall is going to be met in its entirety from spending, then £63 billion needs to be found from government spending, which is a huge amount. After a period of time where the public finances have been very restrained. This is different from 2010, where public spending had grown very rapidly over the previous decade. That is not the case now. So what are we sort of talking about here in terms of what is going to happen next? Now, the choices for the government are, having hoped that the markets would be fine. That is clearly not the case. And yesterday we saw sort of gilt yield, essentially the interest rate that the government has to pay on their borrowing, going up once again. So the markets are unsettled. It does very much feel as if the government needs to take action here, or we will see further turbulence, further increases in interest rates, which will feed through ultimately into mortgage rates, or we and the pound falling further, which adds to inflationary pressure. So the do nothing, just stick with the plan, no longer looks credible. The next option is to try to find the money through spending cuts. And as I've said, the sums required are enormous at a period of time when a lot of public services are under considerable pressure. The inflation has eaten up the cash settlement that was in place, set in place at the last spending review. And we are struggling with some of the post-COVID realities and pressures, that we have got a very tight labour market, and trying to hold public sector pay to the levels that is currently proposed looks immensely difficult. We're likely to see quite a lot of industrial unrest. So all of that makes it look, I think, incredible to think you can do this on spending alone. Politically, it would be impossible to deliver. The public wouldn't accept it, Conservative MPs wouldn't accept it, and the markets, I don't think, would believe it. That then leaves spending increases, tax increases, which is, of course, hugely difficult for a government that has just come in and cut taxes, and a prime minister that has been elected on the basis that she would cut taxes and there would be no new taxes. It's probably the least worst option for them, but politically humiliating. Where are we likely to end up? It's probably not going to be one thing or the other. They probably won't fill in the entire black hole they've put into the public finances. So there may be a little bit more borrowing, the markets may accept. They won't do it entirely from spending, but they might be able to find something from spending. I think that's going to be immensely difficult, but they might be able to find something from spending. I think tax is going to have to carry quite a lot of the heavy lifting here. That'll be, as I say, immensely politically difficult. So where does that leave us in terms of charities? I mean, just one thing to add to what Matt was saying. Of course, if we do see interest rates staying high, which looks quite likely, and that feeds through into mortgage rates, that will have an impact on the housing market. For those charities that are reliant on legacies, for example, that's not going to be good news. So we've got that to worry about as well. Spending, I think, will be tightly controlled. What we've not yet seen any rhetoric coming from the government along the lines of David Cameron's Big Society, the argument that charities could do more and fill some of the roles that were previously performed by the state. We're not hearing anything along those lines as yet, but one wonders if those arguments might be used, and whether there is an argument that charities can use in terms of its communications with the government, that there are certain services that it is able to provide perhaps more efficiently and more cheaply than could be provided within the public sector. Maybe there are some opportunities there. I wouldn't want to overstate that argument. I think it's also the case that all the usual rules do still apply in terms of what is the best way to make a case to the government in terms of presenting evidence, not over-claiming, maintaining credibility. If you're after government money, build up that relationship, do come across as a reliable entity that can promise what it can deliver and deliver what it promises. I think all of those factors remain true. But I don't think anyone should pretend that this is anything other than a difficult environment for the economy. The higher levels of interest rates, the tighter monetary policy that is sadly now necessary, may well put the UK in recession and keep it there for longer than would otherwise be the case. And we're starting to see projections along those lines. So I'm afraid it's going to be a bumpy couple of years. Nor do I think we should think that at the end of this there'll be a change of government, everything will be rosy. The economy now faces significant challenges. It has got to regain credibility with the markets. To do that does require some fiscal discipline. And so just at a period of time where it looks as if the spending taps could be turned on a little bit, I think that's going to be quite difficult. Even if taxes are going up, I think it's going to be a difficult environment for public spending. Nonetheless, it's I don't believe that we're going to see £60 billion worth of spending cuts or even £40 billion worth of spending cuts. But it's going to be a period of time where the pressures are going to be greater. Potentially the sources of revenue for charities are going to be tighter, as Matt has been arguing, and public spending, at the very least, is going to be pretty tightly constrained. Not the cheeriest of messages, I know, but I'm afraid I think that's where we are.
David. Claire, obviously, citizens' advice are very much on the front line, hearing the different types of advice that people want. Perhaps you can tell us what the cost of living crisis is having in terms of demand for your services, and what are you anticipating in the months ahead, given the pretty bleak economic background that we've just heard from Matt and David?
Yeah, certainly. So let me talk a little bit about it from the perspective of our clients, our advisors, and our charities. Citizens Advice is a federated charity. We are made up of 258 local citizens advice across England and Wales, and then the national charity. Matt was saying earlier that the charity sector often doesn't have timely data. Well, good news. Citizens Advice does have extremely timely data. We have just published our latest cost of living dashboard, which is brings the picture that we are telling, or the story that we're telling in pictures of what's happening in terms of the cost of living crisis. So it brings it right up to date with data to the end of September. And what we're seeing is a crisis that has been unfolding in real time, really since the beginning of the year, and has become more acute since April, when the energy price cap went up. Interestingly, before it happened, we were all very focused on just what a big jump that was going to be. As soon as it did happen, we all started to worry about October, the even bigger jump we saw coming. So it's got a bit lost. That was a huge increase. Energy bills, even with the government's price guarantee, are nearly double what they were at the start of the year. And we're seeing that coming through in the people who are coming to us for help. So in particular, we've seen rising and kind of consistently record-breaking levels of demand for crisis support. So that's where we're helping people to get food bank vouchers or to access charitable donations. September was yet another record month for that. Another thing we're watching very carefully is the number of people who come to us because they can't top up their prepayment meter, and that's been, that's much higher has been much higher through the whole of 2022 than in previous years. But we in June, when we started our cost of living series, we kind of fitted a curve and to a sort of where we would get to if we continued on at the current level. And each month since, we've been getting more steeply up from that. So we're really worried about what people are experiencing. We're seeing very large numbers of people who are coming to look for advice on our website, where we have huge amounts of information, but particularly people are looking for information on how to get help with energy bills, and how to access things like personal independence payment, the disability benefit. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're also seeing demographic differences. So we are seeing, some people from particular groups, so particularly high proportion of people from Black African, Black Caribbean and Black British communities who are needing to access food banks, a sharp increase in people with disabilities. So it's a pretty difficult picture. I think what we're concerned about is that these problems are already there. We've been seeing problems arising in summer that we would normally expect to see in winter. We're now starting to get into winter when we know that costs are higher for many people, particularly if you're on a prepayment meter and you can't spread the cost of your energy through the year. Then the actual amount of money that you need to put into a prepayment meter over the winter months, we estimate that's about £260 more than someone who's using the same amount of electricity but or energy, but on a prepayment, on a direct debit. So that's a significant amount of additional cash that people need to find in an environment where they don't have it. And then obviously looking ahead to the spring of next year, the debates raging at the moment, as David referenced, about uprating benefits. If benefits are uprated in line with earnings rather than inflation, that's a real terms cut of 5%. In the amount of money that people on benefits have to live on. And that's getting pretty close to the entire impact of the benefits freeze, which existed between about 2015 and 2020. So really difficult circumstances, and we are our key asks for government at this point are about absolutely maintaining the inflation-related increase uprating for benefits, and also ensuring that people aren't forced onto prepayment meters over the winter if they have energy debt, because we know that that's likely to result in even higher numbers of people who can't top up prepayment meters. So that's the picture for our clients. For our advisors, obviously, this is something which affects everyone. So our advisors themselves are affected by the cost of living crisis. It is also very, very difficult as we experience high levels of demand, and particularly, we're seeing problems become more numerous, more complex. People are coming to us closer to crisis point than they would have in the past, people who've never needed to use our services before. And it's harder to find things that help people because some of the tools that we've traditionally used are much more difficult when so many people are coming to us at a point where they literally can't make ends meet. So around half of our debt clients are now in what we call a negative budget, which is a fancy way of saying that their inescapable outgoings are simply more than the income that they've got coming in. So we're thinking very hard about the well-being of our advisors. We're also, across the charity sector, there's been a shift in the way that people think about volunteering. I think the pandemic produced quite a surge of interest in volunteering, but around what's known as episodic volunteering. So people doing a thing, going and buying shopping for somebody or helping somebody with a specific task, and then kind of switching back off until something else comes. We and a number of other charities depend really heavily on fantastic advisors who commit to doing the training, becoming real experts in the areas that we advise on, and then making that regular commitment to be there for clients. And that is a big ask of people, and we are both really grateful to our volunteers and constantly trying to think about how we support them and make it continue to be attractive. And then lastly, just for the organisations themselves, obviously again, the costs, rising costs, rising interest costs, rising energy costs, rising kind of costs, everything that kind of flows through from that. Those are costs which are making providing services more expensive for our local citizens' advice. We are, like other people, finding that funders are squeezed. So at local government, which has traditionally been a funder of citizens' advice, has been very much squeezed over the last decade or so. And the issue Matt described of kind of flat cash funding, we're seeing very commonly across all of our funders, and flat cash, which has been eroded slowly over kind of the past few years, is now being eroded really very quickly. And I think that's causing funders to look for what's the kind of lowest cost way of delivering service, rather than necessarily really wanting to engage in a conversation about what's the service that produces the best outcome for people. So just to try and end on a little note of optimism, we are continuing. I suppose my biggest optimism is around the people who our advisors, all the people who work in our services, whether they're volunteers or paid members of staff who are providing that service, and the optimism of people who come to us, and even if we can't do everything, we can't kind of help them solve all their problems, just helping people to take a step forward and feel that they've got getting some control over what's happening. That is hugely positive thing. And also continuing using our data, just to go back to where I started, to really make that case a very kind of, to be able to demonstrate that things need to happen, but to do that by being able to create the link from the stories of the people who come to us for help, the aggregate data that we can see, and then link that to policy solutions that would really make a difference. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Claire. I think we're now ready for questions. So just a reminder that you can use the Slido window on the right-hand side of the video. So we've got some questions already coming in. Perhaps, Matt, you could take this one. How should charities think about this period? Is it like COVID? Is it like 2008, the financial crisis? Or is it just completely different? And what are your thoughts on that? How bad was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps it's a the sad answer is it's probably a combination of past crises, actually, in that, I mean, fundamentally, as with all of these economic shocks, the country is poorer than it otherwise would be, and so that creates very tough choices and lots of difficulty. And it's precisely in that situation where you want charities to be able to step up, but it is also precisely in that situation where charities themselves find themselves under pressure. And I think similar to COVID, there is an issue around trading income. So what you actually saw coming out of the financial crisis and austerity, and a sort of conscious decision on the part of charities to diversify their income base and to move more towards trading income. You can see that in the data. And then sort of ironically, COVID comes along and you have to close lots of those trading arms, whether they were shops or whether they were events or whatever else. We're not in that world right now, but we are in a world in which cost of living crisis, everyone's cutting back, and so there's going to be less funds coming in from those sources again. So that is a problem. As with the financial crisis and what followed, I think there is, and Claire and David both touched on this, there is this reduction in funds that will be coming from government, and a sort of focus on taking everything back down to its sort of like bare minimum and getting things done as cheaply as you possibly can. So I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on charities too. And then where I think perhaps in both of those crises, that in the end the pressure that we face in terms of public donations wasn't quite as bad as we might have expected going into them, because, as I said before, ultimately people were able to look through what they saw as being temporary situations, or recognize that while the country was in a sort of poor situation, their personal situation was okay, primarily because unemployment didn't sort of spike to the extent we did. This time round, I think that there is a very high risk that, particularly if we get this wrong in terms of policy reaction, we end up in that downward spiral where unemployment does go up, housing costs go up to the extent we start to see repossessions, and you get into a genuine sort of economic depression. And that then means that you get public donations falling through the floor as well, which we didn't see in those two crises. I think that's a problem. And so the answer to that is, as we saw with COVID, and it's sort of the positive thing here, is funder understanding. And so we saw with the foundations and grant-making trusts, they really stepped up to the plate with COVID, stepped in, provided resources, provided it in a way that charities needed, flexibility and so on. And we're seeing it again this time a little bit, where you had National Lottery coming out just recently saying that they're going to increase some of their donations in relation to inflation. So if we can get that again from those big funders, then that will help. But take nothing away, this is a very serious crisis, and it's a combination of what we've seen before, I think.
And one for Claire. You mentioned the data that Citizens Advice has, but the government itself has a lack of data on charities. So does the panel think this will impede its judgment when reviewing its support for the sector in 3 months' time?
So I guess, I'm bound to say yes, aren't I? Because I know I'm a great believer in the value of data in order to make sure that you're understanding what's happening. And at any point when you're making decisions, if you make decisions without sight of the data, they're likely to be less good decisions. So data isn't everything, don't get me wrong. But just to kind of reflecting back on what Matt was talking about, we don't know what we're seeing at the moment. There are all sorts of different historical analogies that we might be close to, but we don't really know what we're seeing. And if the most recent data that we've really got is going back to pre-pandemic, pre-cost of living crisis, pre all of the current upheaval, it's difficult to know that those decisions can be as good as they might be. Just to take an example from our experience, so at the start of the pandemic, like everybody else, we took face-to-face services and turned them all into remote services because that was all we could do under lockdown. And our help to claim service for people making an initial claim for universal credit was one of those services, and we managed to go on continuing. We continued to provide a service, and we saw about the same number of people. But we know from our data that we saw different people. We saw fewer people. We saw fewer disabled people, for example, and so the group of people we were helping changed. Now we know that from our data, and so we can articulate why it's important to have face-to-face services as part of the range of services that are provided. But if that sort of data isn't being collected, or if it's not being kind of understood by government, then when it comes to making decisions about commissioning services, they are at risk of making the wrong decisions. And on a larger scale, that's the same question we've got here.
Thanks for that, Claire. David, there's been quite a lot of questions coming in about spending cuts, obviously a lot of concern about that and the impact that might have. You said you didn't think 60 billion was likely. What sort of level of spending cuts do you think government might be thinking about, and which sort of departments might take the brunt of that?
Yeah, that's a good and difficult question. As I say, I think if you look at where government expenditure is, a lot of it goes on the NHS. I think in the current circumstances, it's hard to see how that could be cut. In fact, it's hard to see how it sort of maintains the current budget. The government still has got commitments to increase spending on defence, which is very expensive if they meet that commitment to spend 3% of GDP. So that's quite hard. Benefits, well, we've got this row. In the end, I think they are going to up rate in line with inflation. I think they will back down from that. But that is, that's a big part of government expenditure. So it becomes harder and harder. Now, you could argue that the capital budget was pretty generous when Rishi Sunak set it out. It's less generous now because of inflation. But it also is a curious thing to cut if your focus is on growth. But they might find something there. I think in terms of international development, I would be worried about that budget, and wouldn't be at all surprised if they move back to 0.5% of GNI expenditure rather than the 0.7%, which was previously legislated for. So I think that's one to watch. Where does all of this get you in aggregate? It's not that high. I mean, the one thing they might try to do is have some really tough spending settlements beyond the spending review period, which is beyond the next general election, but not specify precisely how they're going to cut. But that won't have very much credibility with the markets. So I don't think that works very much. So you'll notice I'm sort of avoiding giving a number on here. I think it's sort of quite hard, but I'd struggle to see how credibly you can get beyond, at best or worst, depending upon your point of view, 10, 15 billion pounds. I mean, that any higher than that, I don't think you'd be credible. And I'm not entirely confident that even those numbers are credible.
And what do you think are the priorities of the new government? I mean, obviously they've talked about growth, but I mean, where do you think that that's going to be coming from, and how can charities try to make their voices heard and have input into policy with this new growth agenda?
Well, growth is very much what they're saying is their priority, and I think that's going to be uncomfortable for a couple of years where growth is not going to be very good. The approach that the Prime Minister and Chancellor set out in terms of growth is largely get government out of the way. So lower taxes, less regulation. Now, to the extent that charities can kind of assist in that, it's not obvious that there are many charities who are sort of placed to do things. But look, I know that the Prime Minister is interested in public sector reform. If there are arguments about ways in which charities can assist in terms of delivering public services more efficiently, I think there would be an appetite to listen to that. But one other factor is worth bearing in mind is a sort of very strong impression being given by the government that it dislikes anything that approaches nannying. So sort of charities who might be involved in trying to change personal behavior to reduce pressures down the line. I'm not sure that they're going to get a very sympathetic hearing from the government at the moment. So it's quite challenging, and I think it's a fair enough question, but getting charities to sort of be able to align with those priorities in the way that the government sees those priorities being met is for most charities, I suspect, not straightforward.
And Claire, I mean, how are your relations with the government?
So, I mean, we have good relations and interesting discussions. I think this question about how do charities align with any set of government's priorities is interesting, because it is important to understand where governments are coming from and to look at activities to find things which are which are supportive rather than completely at cross purposes. I think the interesting thing about the current debate is that actually I don't think anybody would disagree with the idea that growth is a good thing and something to be supported. I think there are the two issues that arise. One is there is an issue about timing. So the tendency is to say, the government wants more high-skilled, high-paid jobs, which no one would disagree with, but then link that to a kind of immediate things which like not uprating benefits. So it's got to be things that work in the timescale. If you want people to be in higher paid, high skilled jobs, then you've got to support them in a timescale that works for them to do that. The other part of the debate, which is not really emerging at the moment, is this idea that growth is kind of separate from, for example, sustainability, whether that's environmental sustainability or kind of human sustainability. And I think part of, so many charities in one way or another are supporting growth, but we're supporting growth in a broader sense than this kind of the very narrow way in which it's currently being presented. So some of what we can do is try and help, be part of that discussion, help make the case for a broader based understanding of growth that we're all then well equipped to contribute to.
And Claire, maybe you can also help out, and Matt. Many charities rely on corporate partnerships. So how would you see this relating to encouraging redistribution that you touched on, Matt?
So if I jump in on that then, I think what's interesting is, we did some work a little while ago looking at corporates and the sort of increasing move towards, social responsibility and ESG and a sense of providing social value as well as commercial value. But that focus, I think, all too often is sort of, we talk about parallel purpose. So it's sort of existing alongside the social sector, but you've not necessarily got those connections into the charities and community groups that are right next door to the office building, where actually that's what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so I think there is an opportunity here, particularly because we don't know which way this will go for corporates, and probably the answer is different ways for different ones. But will they, in the midst of a crisis, want to double down on that agenda and recognise that as responsible businesses, they want to support the community around them, or will they be, cutting back as much as they can, and so that sort of nice to have of the ESG gets dropped? We don't know which way that will go, but given that there will be fewer resources around to do more good, which will be needed, then by connecting with the social sector, with those charities, with those community groups that are around them, learning from them as to what works, what's already out there, how do you build on things that are successful. I think that's that has to be a really important part of the response from corporates. And for the sector, for the social sector, that means also looking for those opportunities, being ready and flexible in the way that you perhaps engage with corporates as and when they want to engage. And I think we've already made some moves in that direction. I think things have improved over the last few years. So we don't know which way the corporate sector will go, but I think increasing those connections with the social sector is really important.
And do you have a view on?
Sorry,
Claire, do you have a view on that, on partnerships, corporate partnerships?
Yes, I mean, very much to agree with Matt. I mean, there's a kind of obvious redistributional element of when corporates, big corporates are looking at their levels of profits and thinking about how they can help to support activities going on in the community. Then that's a kind of obvious redistribution. But there are we have some interesting partnerships with, for example, with TSB, where we've trained some of their staff as advisors, and we also provide advice in some bank locations. So it is partly about just kind of bringing together the bits of the world that the corporates see and the bits of the world that we see, and having just building that mutual understanding and creating a sense, a more anything that breaks down the barriers and makes people less think in terms of other, has to be a good thing.
I think we've probably only got time for one last question for all the panel. Do you think there's any lessons that can be learned from the actions of VCS organisations in the 2008 crisis, which can help support organisational resilience, given the many problems that charities will be facing in the months ahead?
Should I jump in on that one? Just
Yes.
to say, I think that actually, the sector's come a very long way since 2008. There's been a lot of professionalisation. There's been lots of, as I say, diversification of income. There's been lots of thinking about how you can be more effective in investing in technology and skills and people and so on and so forth. But the sector only has the freedom to do that if funders allow them to. And that's going to be very difficult in the environment going forward. And so I think one of the lessons from 2008 is not to get into false economies, if you like. So something, the bit of work we did recently with a coalition of children's charities was looking at what happened to spending on statutory children's services across different local authorities in the country, and comparing that to where you'd seen the biggest reductions in spending on early intervention, and it was a one-to-one relationship. You cut spending on the prevention, you end up spending more on the cure further down the line. And charities have this sort of insight and this knowledge and this ability to provide part of the solution there. And it's important that, like I say, we don't fall into the trap of false economies. And just today, you've seen it with the labour market stats. Record number of people inactive because of ill health. Again, lots and lots of charities up and down the country exist to support exactly those people, to help them back into the workforce. But if we're not investing in them, in those charities, and supporting them to do that, then we'll miss out on that opportunity. And then a year down the line, we'll be scratching our heads as to why we've got too many people out of work.
Actually, David, how would you address the economic inactivity that we've seen in the recent figures? It seems to be a sort of growing problem. Obviously, presumably there's a long COVID effect, but I mean, what's the Treasury thinking about the level of economic inactivity? Is it something that they are going to be concerned about, you think?
Yes, I'm sure it is. I think it's a very good point, and I think Matt's right to highlight that as a potential opportunity for charities. Whether the government will seize that. They've said very little about this particular issue, but it is quite remarkable. The economy is clearly facing great difficulties, and yet the unemployment rate is at a record low. So part of that, it's not the only reason, but part of the explanation for that is a lot of people out of the labour market because of ill health, largely long COVID issues, but challenges there in terms of healthcare. And so one thing we might expect from the government, but we haven't heard anything yet, is some sort of coordinated push to do something about it. And yes, I think Matt is right that there is the potential for the charitable sector to play a big role in that.
And Claire, are you seeing some of these people coming to your advice bureaus suffering from ill health or other issues relating to COVID?
I don't know particularly relating to COVID, but I think one of the things I would really like to kind of leave people with is the interrelationship between health, both physical and mental, and the wider factors. Certainly, the things that people come to us for help on: income, employment, housing, relationships. All of those things, they are actually the things that determine people's health. And so, exactly as Matt was saying, one of the things that charities can do is put that focus on those wider issues and the preventative element, which I know from having worked in the health sector for many years, it's really, really hard. However much people talk about it, it's very hard for the NHS to go upstream and really think about the preventative end. And that's what we can do as charities, and then really talk about what we're doing in terms of the value. So it's not about charities that need to be supported, it's about really understanding the value that charities are bringing, and in terms of supporting people's health and well-being.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. So I'd like to thank all the panelists and the attendees today. And just to remind everyone, if you'd like to learn more about the work of Pro Bono Economics and get invitations to more events, then do sign up for the newsletter. And if you'd like to support the work of PBE, then just press the donate button. Thank you very much.